Hello and welcome to 5.1 Lab 4. This lab is going to be almost very similar, if almost identical, to Lab 5.1 Lab 3 with one major exception. In the last lab we did the while loop. In this lab we're going to do the for loop. So we're going to do a similar thing but in using the for instead of a while. Now, sometimes these loops, the while and for loop, can be interchangeable. Sometimes it makes sense to use one over the other. Typically use for when you know how many you're going to count, while when you don't know how many times you're going to loop, an unknown loop count, but that's not always the case. So sometimes it's personal preference. So you need to open these files, 5.1 lab 4.js and all that. We're going to have a variable section with a counter variable and a string from the user, just like we did before. So let's take a look at that. So here I have variable counter and variable user string, just like before. And then in our loop section, we're going to use a for loop and the counter variable, and we're going to loop through. 0 is going to be assigned to the counter variable, and we're going to loop through the 5 times, test if it's less than 5, increment it, and then we're going to prompt the user to assign the value to the string and display it on the page. So just like we did before, it's going to look like that. It's going to look identical on the screen. We're just doing it a little different way. So here's how a for loop works. A for loop, instead of like a while loop where you just have a condition and you're testing whether it's true or not, here we're saying, okay, we have this counter that we're setting equal to 0, and then don't forget your semicolon. That's what we're using to count through, and then this is our condition. As long as that counter is less than 5, then a semicolon, and then every time we loop through, we're incrementing the counter, whereas in a while loop we had the counter increment down here towards the bottom. Here you put it in the parentheses of a for loop. So here's how this works. It's going to start off at 0, it's going to prompt them, and it's going to write it to the page. Next time it comes around, it's going to increment, so the value of the counter is not going to be 0, it's going to be 1, 1 less than 5, prompt, write it, increase, right here, 2 less than 5, prompt, write, increase, 3, and so on and so forth until eventually it hits 5, and 5 less than 5, it returns false, so therefore it stops the whole loop from running. So it's very similar to a while loop. It just depends on your preference. I tend to personally use more for loops than while loops, but you may find you do it differently. So, but that doesn't mean I don't ever use while loops, because there's times where it makes more sense to do that. So go ahead and do this, put this code together, and here's how it's supposed to work. Let me refresh my screen and say hi, looping is still this time very cool. If I open it up, hi, looping is still very cool. So give it a whirl, and hopefully you'll get it to come out like this. If you have any questions, let me know, and happy coding.